Welcome to From Diversity to Inclusion, How to Audit Your Collection and Why. I'm Kim Poe, Children and Young Adult Consultant with the Connecticut State Library. Today we're going to talk about diversity audits and building inclusive collections, and a PDF of these slides and a handout with that information and others should be available for you. So we're going to start the day discussing exactly what a diversity audit is, why we should audit our collections, and why it's going to be a little hard for some of us to do that. While it's important not to stop at diversity, we're also going to talk about why it's important to make sure that our collections are inclusive as well. We'll look into the logistics of performing these audits. Then, like I said, I'll provide some resources on locating and identifying diverse titles. Because I'm the youth consultant, a lot of my examples are going to fall into the youth category, but if someone who works in adult services should happen to stumble across this, the same basic principles are scalable to just about any situation. So what's a diversity audit? It's a count of titles to help you determine what percentage of your collection is made up of the non-dominant voice. It's important to make sure that your materials reflect the diversity not only in your community, but in your country as well. So why do we need to audit our collections? Because the industry isn't necessarily set up to do it for us. This chart was compiled by Lee and Lowe in 2019. It's a breakdown of the publishing industry by race, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. This chart was compiled from 7,893 responses within the publishing industry. 153 companies participated, including all of the big 5 publishers, 8 review journals, 47 trade publishers, 35 university presses, and 63 literary agencies of all sizes from across North America. If you click on the title, which is a hyperlink, you'll be able to access 7 other charts that look shockingly similar to this. This one that we're looking at is the publishing industry overall. The other charts break down these various identifiers on the executive level, editorial level, sales level, marketing and publicity level, book reviewer level, literary agent level, and intern level. The only level that is less than 74% white is the intern level, which is really something to sit with. So many of you are probably familiar with this slide. This 2018 infographic shows us the percentage of diverse representation in children's literature in 2018. I've sat through a lot of workshops and presentations where this image is used, and just want to share with you something that I noticed that I don't always hear discussed, because there's a lot to pull from this image. We can see that there are more books published with animal protagonists than other non-white races here. But something to point out is that there are more books published about animals in 2018, animals and non-human objects, than books with Native American, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and African Americans combined. So with books like Bear, Seas, Colors, and Pete the Cat, and This Book is Gray, and whatever, it can be easy to justify such a large percentage of animal books at 28% animal and others. But an unconscious message is being delivered when there are more books about animals than not one, but all non-white races combined. And keep in mind, I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that some of the non-white books that you see here, so the 1%, Native, 5% Latinx, I don't think they were all written by people who identify as such. So some of these percentages might in fact be books that were written by white authors. So the infographic, or the information in this infographic, is representative of information compiled by the CCBC, the Cooperative Children's Book Center, and made by Reflection Press also in 2018. There's a lot of information here, but I would like to draw your eyes to the black box. A quick reminder, this graphic is providing us information on book equity or book equality and not book equity. This image is telling the viewers how many more books need to be published by authors of color and Indigenous authors to have a ratio equal to the ratio of books by white authors to white Americans. So we're just talking about equality here, not equity or justice. And you'll see that as of 2018, we would have needed 1,051 more books spread across various non-white races, and Indigenous people to be made quote unquote equal to the books published by white authors for white children. And the access to this chart is also a hyperlink. The title is a hyperlink. Now, because I just threw out words like equity and equality, I think it's really important to look at this image, which is a really lovely personification of the difference of those words. So we've got inequity, which I would hope we all kind of have a grasp on at this point, and then, or inequality, I'm sorry, and then equality, where you'll see we have two ladders that are the same height, but there's still one child that can't access anything from the giving tree. Then when we reach equality, we have finally lifted that one child's ladder, and can feel like the job has been done. But you'll notice looking at that apple tree that the resources still aren't distributed in a manner that both children can benefit until we reach justice. So what? So why did I tell you all of this? Because the system is not currently set up for libraries to unconsciously curate an inclusive collection. If we truly want inclusive collections, truly being the key word here, we must build them with intentionality and take ownership of our collections. And while steps are being taken to correct this inequity with Own Voices, which has gone down a path that I don't think was intended, Disrupt Text, Drag Queen Story Hours, books like The Hate U Give and Dear Martin, it may feel like we can begin to depend on the publishing industry and book Twitter to help us curate our collections with their vast array of hashtag diverse book lists, but here's why it's more complicated than that. I'm going to play an episode from a web series. It's 4 minutes long, but very worth it, and it's very satirical. It's an obvious over the top kind of moment in this clip, but more necessary, I think, than we want to believe.
Thank you so much. Do you mind if we start recording?
Yeah, go ahead, of course.
This is Kiari Rome interviewing Adrienne Bell for Dark Stories in the Light. First off, thank you so much for this. As you know, diversity is such a hot issue right now. And this podcast is looking to find and really honor those stories of diverse employees such as yourself who find themselves working in traditionally non-diverse work environments.
Well, I mean, I guess you wouldn't expect someone like me to be doing PR for artisanal goat cheese.
Exactly.
Because everyone knows that I am partial to Wensleydale.
Well, yes, but it's also because they...
Okay, who am I kidding? You're right. I'm a Stitchelton girl all the way. Guilty as charged.
Okay, well, why don't we just start from the beginning of your story? Tell me a little bit about how you grew up.
Okay. Well, my mother was a narcissistic college professor, and my father was a chemist. He actually lost his sense of smell, and that kind of sent him into a deep depression. And so, things were tense, but we muddled through.
And how often did you see your dad?
Every day.
Huh. You lived with your dad. Okay, how often did you see your mom?
Also, every day I lived with both my parents.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the neighborhood that you grew up in.
I don't know, pretty typical for a family like mine, I guess.
So, like, a little rough.
Sometimes, sure, yeah.
Could you describe that a little bit? Feel free to lean into that memory.
Well, there was this one thing that always happened. The turnover for the guard gate was really, really high. And so like every 2 months, there'd be like someone else new there and they didn't have the codes. And so like none of the cars could get in or out.
You lived in a gated community?
In high school, yeah, my dad patented this. Like,
okay, I don't think this is going to work out.
Oh, is it the shortbread fingers? I do have bourbon creams. I'm just afraid they're stale.
Yeah, we're looking for like a black story.
Well, I am black, and this is my story, so does not make it a black story.
You know what I mean.
You want to hear of struggle? Well, let me tell you about riding side saddle or waiting for the right to vote.
Well, it's not like my life was never hard, okay? I don't escape into Victorian fantasy for no reason.
Go on.
Well, look, I was weird, I was awkward, I was uncomfortable, and when I started reading about the Victorian era and everyone was so elegant and polished and everyone just knew exactly what to say and exactly how to say it.
Did you drop a hip-hop track? Did you go to jail?
No.
Okay, we're done here.
Oh, I assure you, darling, my narrative is as black as my Uncle Stefan's lungs after he died of a consumption.
Can I get you a snack for the road?
I'm sorry about the mix-up, but if you do happen to remember anything that's a little bit more on brand, you can totally give me a call.
Joke's on you, madam. These bourbon creams aren't stale at all.
So that show is called Black Girl in a Big Dress, as you may have noticed. Every episode's around 5 minutes long. They're available on YouTube. I highly suggest it. But while this video was kind of over the top and obviously very, very satirical, it's not entirely out of left field. Like the creator, who was also the star of that show, very deliberately put in this episode of the web series. So consider, are most of your books about Indigenous people historical? Do most of the books in your collection about African Americans or Black characters take place in urban spaces? When you look at books in your collection featuring characters from the LGBT community, are they always coming out of the closet? Are most of your books about Latinx characters about immigrating to America, illegally coming to America, or being undocumented in America? When evaluating our collections, it's really important that it's really important that the pieces of our collection about various marginalized communities don't primarily tell a single story. When we look at our collection, it's important that we look really closely and not just kind of at who's on the cover. I can't begin to stress how important it is for someone afraid to tell the world about their sexuality, afraid of anyone finding out their immigration status, afraid of driving through a neighborhood to be able to pick up a book in our collection and find their story. That necessity is magnanimous. End of sentence. At the same time, so yes, and as opposed to no, but at the same time, it's important to remember that there is more than 1 or 5 ways to be a member of the LGBT community, or to be an immigrant, or to be Black. So I highly suggest everyone watch this video that I'm going to play a very small clip of by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. It breaks down not only her experience as an African immigrant in America, where people had one example of her life story, but her experience making the same mistakes of assuming a single story about others from marginalized groups. So here is a very small clip of that.
My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well, and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind: the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become.
So I want to take a moment to read out loud. I'm only going to read one of these quotes. If you would like to read both of them, you are welcome to pause the video right now and do that. But I am going to read the bottom quote. It is by the author Nick Stone. If anyone does not know her, Nick Stone is a Black author who has written Dear Martin, Odd One Out, Jackpot, and Clean Getaway. These statements that she's made are predominantly about African Americans. Please keep in mind that the principles are the same for all marginalized groups. Nick Stone is speaking from her experience as a Black reader. So that is what's happening here. I'm going to read the second quote. Black lives didn't matter in books unless they were fighting their way out of abusive relationships or killing their children to keep them out of the bonds of slavery. Black people were sidekicks, lesson bearers, plot devices to teach the white son and daughter of a failed lawyer that racism is real. A statement made by a book that is still held up in just extreme ways, almost despite the message that it can send to the kids of color who read it. And the title of this slide is the hyperlink to the article where these quotes came from. And another one from Nick Stone here at the top. So while reading these books about racism, please also read books about explicitly Black people, especially Black kids, just being human, doing things humans are allowed to do in our imaginations, falling in love, dealing with illness, and navigating time travel, questioning other aspects of their identity, saving their country, and fighting with their parents. The word remember is a hyperlink to where this quote came from, which I believe is from Nick Stone's Instagram page. And there's another quote there. Isaac Fitzsimmons is an author of the Passing Playbook, and an author panel randomly made a statement that I jotted down, where he said they don't need to see trauma and pain to relate to a person. And so many of the books that are held up as new and different and enlightening and deserving of all of the stars can sit kind of in this place of pain. But it's really important that we uplift all of these stories, so that we're not kind of left with only the one. Our books need to be diverse in the sense that we have books on our shelves about characters from the non-dominant group, but our books need to also tell the non-dominant story within that non-dominant group. As we're beginning to see more and more books with marginalized characters, those like librarians like you all fighting to do this work to kind of ground themselves in justice and inclusivity, can miss some of the common stereotypes that act as more of a hindrance than a help. Statements or just sort of ideas, such as Asian American Pacific Islanders have exotic food, or book-loving or non-athletic boys and men are effeminate, or disabled people must overcome their disability rather than just live with their disability, rather than us just reading a story about a person who happens to have a disability, then that disability becoming the person. What we need to look for are more books that I like to think fit here. These are examples of books that deviate from the dominant narrative of their perspective identities, and we need just as many of these books in our collection. In these books, we see non-white characters recreated as Alice in Wonderland, saving the world, dancing ballet, defeating monsters, hunting for a murderer, trying to save loved ones, pretending to date a boy, experiencing personal growth over the summer, discovering a magical world, entering a cooking competition, and falling in love with a ghost. So now that we have an idea of what our collection should look like, how do we physically audit them? So you first need to establish your criteria. What are you going to be auditing for? Are you auditing for race? Are you auditing for ethnicity? What about body positivity? What about Genre. If you're going to audit anyway, is that information that you need? What about neurodiversity or different type of families? You're going to need a shelf list. You can't audit your titles. And do you know what your titles are? And, unless your library has been out of commission for quite some time, some of your titles are going to be checked out. You're going to want to audit those to the best of your ability as well. Research each title for representation. This is where I highly suggest you ask for help. This could be a great job getting preliminary information on authors and books for teen volunteers, even something for them to do at home. If you've got kids who still need volunteer hours, but they can't come into the library, or your library won't allow folks to come in to browse and lounge and work. This is something that can be done virtually. Research the criteria that you have just laid out. And then you're going to, count up what goes where and do a little bit of math to figure out what percentage of your collection is what, and then apply that data in meaningful ways. When I say apply that data in meaningful ways, that might mean looking at your percentages, be it bar graph or pie chart, and you might realize that you really need more books in your collection that feature Native characters. You really need that in your collection. Or depending on what criteria you audited for, you may realize that you need more books that feature Native characters that are not historical fiction. So the items that you'll need to audit your collection are pretty self-explanatory. But the one thing that I would like to draw your attention to is your state or town data. You may find that your community is 80 or even 90% white. If we attach ourselves to that number, it might appear like we don't need to do any of this work. I can imagine that some of your communities are 80 or so percent white, and it's easy to fall into the mindset of there's no insert term here in my community, particularly because other types of information, i.e. sexual or gender identity, neuroability, able-bodiedness, aren't always as easy to locate as racial or ethnic identities or socioeconomic identity. So with that, I kind of want to take a moment to remind folks of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. I mean, it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
So as Dr. Bishop just said, the world is becoming more and more diverse and colorful year after year. But you know what I think? I think we all blinked and missed it because according to the Brookings Institute, as of 2018, less than half of the children under the age of 15 identify as white. The full link is, or the full article is hyperlinked from the title. And again, these slides will be available, but I think we have all lived in this space of one day the world won't be majority white, and one day is here. One day has happened, and what your community looks like today might not be what it looks like tomorrow. Oops, pardon me. So these are screenshots of the audit form I've made and will be available in some manner that I can provide it to download and use. This form is color coded for various things that can be audited for. So the gray section is for author, title, and call number. So just the way you put those things in your library. The green section is for author criteria. So do you want to audit your author? The blue is for the main character. The orange section is genre. This form was compiled from information that I have personally audited for, as well as criteria that was sourced from another audit form. And all of this stuff is available in resources that I have on a LibGuides page, and again, that I will try to put together into a handout for folks. So this is a screenshot from a resource called Diversity Audit, a Practical Guide, which will be in the handout as well and is linked on my LibGuides. Everything here is on one LibGuides page, as well as more. You can go through each title. You go through each title one by one and mark off the appropriate columns where the book fits. So you'll see that one row might have many marks. So for example, the second row from the bottom is indicated that the book in question features a diverse author, that is own voices, is female. The book main character is Middle Eastern / West Asian, because own voices is marked, then that tells you that the author probably identifies as such as well, and the book is set outside of the US. So let's kind of walk through auditing a title. So you'll see here, I have Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. The call number for our book is YTHO in our collection. So going across the sheet from left to right, in the green, I would check mark diverse author because Aidan is Latinx. I would mark own voices, but I want to jump in really quick and say that I recognize that We Need Diverse Books is no longer using the term diverse voices or own voices. They are going forward identifying the author as that author would like to be identified. I made this form before that. I just wanted to make that statement. That being said, perhaps having an author own voices column is helpful for the auditing process, right? That might not be a term that you choose to use going forward, but for the sake of something like this, you might find it useful, or delete it and get it out of there. I would then check mark NB/trans. NB, for anyone who doesn't know, stands for non-binary, and trans is short for transgender. And we'll get to how I know that information on another slide. And then in the blue section, which is for our main character, I would check mark Latinx and LGBTQIA because the main character in the book is both. I would even check mark something that called Own Voices Joyful, and I cannot remember where I got that from. Because this book doesn't contain some of the trauma that we've come to brace ourselves for with regards to a trans person. So does that mean that the main character's experience in the book is perfect and utopian? No, because that wouldn't be an accurate portrayal of a person's life, and it would be the most boring book in the world. So in the orange, I would check contemporary, fantasy, and mystery thriller, because the book is equally all three of those things. Anyone who's read that would probably agree. And that is kind of why I personally find things like genreification hard, because where do you put something like this? So that's basically the process. That is just sort of an idea of what I would do with a book, and that's what you want to do for all of these titles, which is why I'm going to stress again, ask for help. Phone a friend. Break your collection up. Don't look at all of the books in your collection because you will drive yourself mad. Start with something like biographies. Start with something like I don't know, break your fiction collection into sections. So take it one column at a time, because looking out over the sea of books that might appear in your library will be debilitating at the sheer volume of the work ahead of you. So where do we find the books? That is a constant question. So I would say look to your book vendor. Baker and Taylor, for example, started to make it easier to search for books in various categories. Now, is all of this information perfect? Absolutely not. I have no way of knowing if the books here all tell a single story. I would like to assume not, but I don't know, just sort of looking at this screen here. But if you don't know where to turn, and if you don't know what to do, start with the tools that are already available to you. And as a librarian, we have a lot of tools. I could do this all day. That's the last link I have. And again, all of these are hyperlinked. So when you have access to the slides, you will be able to click on any one of these titles and it will take you right to the website. But we have a lot of resources. So you might be thinking that this is a lot of information and it's kind of confusing and it's kind of overwhelming. And that was a lot of links. Can't someone just make a list of titles? But see, that's the problem. They can make a list. They have made a list. And that's why I have a slew of websites that I can share with you. And the list only grows when you add Twitter and personal blogs to the mix. So as I provided consultation with various libraries and people who are performing these audits, I hear a lot, how do I know how an author in particular identifies, or how a book character identifies? I don't want to misrepresent anyone. And I think that's such an important question. I think even asking that question proves that someone's mind is pointing in a positive direction, because it is something to care about and consider. And my off the cuff responses, use the resources that exist for you to figure out this information. We are all library workers, we are educators, and we are information gatherers. So when evaluating characters in books that you haven't read or heard about, consider using something like Goodreads. Pull open the title, open the find feature, Control F, and type in keywords like LGBT, Native, Pacific Islander, Asian American, and see if the review can help you determine what category a book should be in for the purposes of your audit. Search the internet, use Boolean searches in Google, because last I checked, they actually work, where you can type in the book title, the big and then whatever it is that you're looking for. Look to see if a book has the words own voices in the hashtag, again, recognizing the change that has come over that hashtag, because it has been kind of misappropriated. Check the information in the detail section of Baker and Taylor under the term bibliography. That's a screenshot. And that screenshot is telling us that, insert book here features a Black multiracial, fits into the Black and multiracial category. There you turn to Twitter. More and more authors are using their Twitter bios to self-identify. You'll see that Aiden Thomas stated that he's queer, trans, non-binary, Latinx, and uses the pronouns he, they. That's how I knew that information when we went through the audit together. Melinda Lowe uses her bio to tell us that she's a lesbian. We also don't want to assume racial identity either. So while Kelly Yang doesn't have her racial identity in the bio, she uses it to tell us that she's the winner of the 2019 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, and that helps us. You can only audit the information that you can find, which may or may not be everything on that spreadsheet from a couple of slides ago. That's okay. If you're not sure how an author identifies, so you don't want to add it to the spreadsheet, okay. Not sure if a book is own voices, so you don't want to add it to the spreadsheet, okay. Concerned about all the things you're struggling to identify, so you're not sure if you're ready to do an audit at all, that is also okay. So I won't pretend like having a robust, well-rounded, and inclusive collection isn't important. because it is. I also won't pretend like this may not be an involved process or a lot of work, because it is. But I really like to reflect on the term "a lot of work." That term comes up a lot in conversations regarding collection audits. Anything we do while on the clock is work because we're at work. Otherwise, like, we're eating a whole pizza and it's the weekend. So I wonder sometimes if when people say that something is a lot of work, what they actually mean is that it's challenging, it's unfamiliar, it's daunting, it's uncomfortable. And while I acknowledge that with this work, everyone's not going to be ready for it, I also know that this is a vital part of collection management. Ordering books, navigating Baker and Taylor or Follett, planning and running programs, story times with 4-year-olds who don't like you today, cold calling, instigating community outreach efforts. At one point or another, they all may have felt like a lot of work because they were unfamiliar. We were new to librarianship. Migrating from the card catalog to those ugly Big Apple computers was a lot of work for me. And, in that picture that I showed on my first slide, you might be thinking that I am a toddler, which I guess in the library world I am, but I am old enough to vividly remember that transition. But now I can't imagine looking up a title any other way. Transition isn't easy, but we are all the community gatekeepers of the information within our collection. So I think it's important to remind people to take their time. Collection management takes time. In fact, it is an endless process. You order, you weed. You order, you weed. It doesn't stop. Remember, managing a collection, which it should include performing these audits, is a marathon and not a sprint. And I recognize that a part of this process that appears to take up the most of this marathon is finding the titles. So again, sort of back to the idea of, can't you just make a list? It would be easier, faster. I don't have enough time. If copying titles from a suggested list is our approach to all portions of purchasing, every library would have basically the same collection. With that being said, I do have some practical suggestions. Apart from traditional review journals, i.e. School Library Journal, Hornbook, Kirkus, I would suggest identifying 3 to 4 alternative resources to check regularly, or 2 to 3, whatever. For some of you, in addition to your traditional review journals, you might decide to regularly keep an eye on We Need Diverse Books, Disrupt Text, and Lee and Low. You settle there. But someone else overhears a lot of middle grade and high school students talking about various social issues in their community or in their school. And you may begin to get more teacher requests for books about fights for equality. So you decide that maybe you don't necessarily need Disrupt Text. Your teachers are going for it anyway. That's not what your community needs. So you replace checking Disrupt Text with checking social justice books regularly. Perfect for your community. Now, others may recognize that there's a large immigrant population in your community, a growing need for ESL classes and things like that. So you think it's important to regularly check I'm Your Neighbor. Some of you might build or have a good partnership with the LGBTQIA organizations in your community. So you decide you need to give extra attention to the Rainbow Roundtable. Others may need to do a serious overhaul of their collection. So they want to start with Westport's Diverse Books Need Us. And then maybe keep an eye on Project Lit every year because you've got a really, really, really small collection. This is why someone can't do the work for you to make it easier. These are examples of why. This is maybe why it shouldn't be a fast process. And when I say this, I mean they. Our communities deserve our time. They are worth us doing this right, and they are worth us putting effort into managing our collections. The information to do this work is out there. The studies, journals, videos, and history on the importance of a person's ability to see themselves positively portrayed is out there. It is up to us if we want to embark on this journey or not. By doing the work, you are doing the work. There is no end. This is a circle. You just keep going and you just keep doing. This is just a quick overview of a few things to keep in mind. But the most important that I kind of want to leave some of you with, if you are still feeling overwhelmed, audit your carts. Audit your carts when you are purchasing collections. When you are purchasing for your collection, audit then. When you look at your Baker and Taylor cart, I say because we have Baker and Taylor, and you are about to click purchase on 30 titles, take one moment. You've already selected those titles for some reason. Something about these 30 books have made the cut. So you must know something about them. Stop and take a moment and do an audit right there. If you have a regular weeding schedule, and if you are constantly auditing your carts, over time, your collection will fix itself if it needs fixing. And that's going to be all for us today. This is my name, my contact information, my email, and if anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, follow-up, suggested additions, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you. This presentation is on version 3 now, with a short abridged version for those half-hour meetings, and I plan to keep going. Thank you for taking a moment to hear me and listen to me. And I look forward to your emails. Thank you so much.